Welcome back, and thanks for joining me for another worm and vermicomposting episode. This week I'm going to pay special attention to my regular totes because the bins don't quite feel the way I would like them to feel. So I'm going to make sure that I go through my castings really well, and I want to make sure that when you fluff up your castings like I do, that you know to do it gently. It may look like I'm kind of rough with the castings, but I'm only really using the fingertips. I'm not really digging down into it because I don't want to disturb the worms too much. Sometimes they can get irritated, and just mixing up the bedding can cause them to travel. But I am just trying to get a feel for all of the castings in the bin. They are almost there. They still feel a bit heavy, a little too wet. And when you have your own bins, you'll understand what I mean by heavy. There's like weight to the castings when they're the right consistency and have the right moisture content, and these don't quite feel that way. It could be because of the cardboard that I have in here that's keeping the moisture, since these are not as broken down as my other bin, but I definitely want to try to get some of this moisture out of the bin. So what I'm going to do this week is I'm going to give it a regular feeding. As I did fluff this up, I didn't find too much of any food material. So I'm going to give it a regular feeding right down the middle, and I am not going to put a lid on this. I still haven't picked up the mosquito or screen netting that I want to put over the top. So I'm just going to put bubble wrap over the top of this to try to keep the moisture where the bubble wrap is, but still allow it to evaporate. So once I give it the feeding and the grit, I'm just going to cover it up with the bubble tape, and that will be it. I don't see any major issues or any other problems like pests going on in this bin. So otherwise, the health of it looks really well, and that concludes this update. Moving over to my second regular tote. This one does not have the same moisture issue as the other one seems to be having. Now, the castings are a bit wetter than what is in my Vermi bag totes, but this one didn't have the same feel to it. This one was a little bit lighter, and not in color, just in how it felt in my hand. So after I mixed this one all up, I decided that I wasn't going to do anything different with this bin, that I was just going to feed it and put the lid back onto it. Again, whenever you stir up the contents and the bedding, you want to make sure you do it with a gentle hand. Don't scrape too hard so that you don't injure any of the worms, as well as you don't upset them. So with this bin, after it's fed up and it's going to get a regular size feeding, it's just going to be the normal grit and the lid. Moving over to the first of my Vermi bag totes, I am just noting how much the material has dropped and the level in this particular bin. Now, flipping this over, I noticed that there were a lot of worms at the top, and that could be just them coming up for air. That could be an issue inside of the bin, but I don't see any worm trails in the fabric at the top, so I think it was just some of the worms coming up for air. And as I sift through this material, I'm finding lots of different worm balls in this bin, and that could just be from what I fed in this bin last week. But I'm finding a lot of happy worms all throughout the material. I do prefer how this material feels in my hand, and by looking at this material, it's at the point where I need to make the decision, am I going to add more material to this bin, or am I going to let this go to a stage where it's going to start to become harvested? And that was another example of a good worm ball in this bin. But going back to making decisions on this bin, it's starting to become more castings than cardboard. And for this bin, I have decided to not add any additional cardboard to this. I'm going to carry it through as it is, just adding food each week if I deem that it needs to have food in it. And then once it gets to where it is about 80 to 90% castings, then I am going to harvest this bin. So this week it's going to get another good size feeding. As always, the grit to help the worms digest, and then it's going to get covered up after the bubble wrap. Moving over to the second of my Vermi bag totes, and then again I had a large amount of worms on the bubble wrap at the top. Now in comparison to the other bin, there is a significantly less amount of castings in this particular bin, enough so where I have decided that I am not going to send this tote, because the castings feel exactly the same as they do in the other Vermi bag tote, but the castings feel really, really good, but there's not a lot of material. And what I'm trying to avoid doing this time around is harvesting bins that don't have a lot of material, because I'm finding I need more and more material as my outdoor garden gets larger. So even though this is close to being ready to harvest, I am going to add cardboard to this bin. Since I've decided to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm trying to find right now all of the material that is, or I shouldn't say material, all of the food that is in this bin. So I'm sifting through and making sure that I don't have any other apple pieces that is in the bin. And it's been about 3 weeks that these apples have been being worked on by the worms in the bin. So I'm making sure that there aren't any other pieces of the apple that are in here. And then I'm going to give this a larger feeding than I normally would, but I'm going to put a large feeding into this, and then put additional cardboard on the top and make sure that I wet this down. So this one I am going to harvest when I harvest the regular totes. Again, I don't want to try to do all these different harvesting times, and since the regular totes are about a month behind these totes, I'm going to harvest this one with those. That way I still keep somewhat of a schedule going on. So maybe I will harvest the first Vermi bag tote with the Vermi bag mini, and then do this one with the other two. Moving over to the Vermi bag mini, the last and final bin I have in my house, which is also the only flow-through system that I own. Now, last week I put cardboard on the top to raise the level of the material in the bin, And anytime I add cardboard to a bin, I find that the next week on top it's pretty dry and crunchy. So I'm definitely going to be adding some moisture to this bin. Great thing about any Vermibag system is that you can never add too much moisture. The way that the bins are set up, it allows for the moisture to flow through and come out the bottom. So even though it's not in view, at the bottom of this Vermibag Mini there is a tray to collect any liquid, but rarely, if ever, is there liquid in that bin. I think it's been over a year since I've had any liquid flow through the bin, but this definitely needs some water added. It may not look like it from this view, but when I dug down into it, it did feel a bit crispy. Since I'm going to add some water to this, I'm also going to give it a good size feeding this week just to encourage the worms to come through that level of newly added material. The thing that is important with flow through systems, you don't want your worms to be traveling downward. You want to keep the worms towards the top so that as the material travels downward and it gets compressed, you're not compressing the worms or harvesting and finding that you have a lot of worms towards the bottom, which you have to sift out. This bin, once I fed it and given it the grit, looks really good. The worms were still kind of just below that cardboard, so I don't have to worry about that too much. But after I've given it the food and everything, there's really not much more to do with the bin. It looks great as well. No big issues with any other pests or beetles in here. So this is all done. Concludes the video for this week. Thank you for sticking to the end with me and watching the whole video. I hope you've enjoyed the content, and if you'd like to watch more, you can always go back to the beginning of the series. Thanks for watching.